Hello again, and welcome back. Final Fantasy V is quite the underrated gem. It has a colorful cast of characters and a lighthearted story that makes it unique in the franchise. It also brought about one of the best job systems in the series, in which, especially at the time of release, was quite impressive for its time. We see a ton of these aspects make its way to the future games in the series. So without further ado, this is Final Fantasy V References in Final Fantasy XIV. So as always, this is your spoiler warning. While there may not be as many big spoilers for Final Fantasy V or Final Fantasy XIV this time around, this is more of a precautionary warning as there are still aspects of the story for both games being told within this video. Final Fantasy V was released in 1992 for the Super Famicom system in Japan. The West did not see a release, however, until it was released for the PlayStation in 1999 with the Final Fantasy Anthology. The original box art for the Super Famicom gives us a look at Bartz and his chocobo, Boko. This art was made into a minion in Final Fantasy XIV when it was included with the Stormblood Collector's Edition. Additional items in the Collector's Edition include the Chicken Knife, which is one of the most powerful weapons in Final Fantasy V, and Sildra, who is Ferris's pet sea dragon and childhood friend. 6 other minions aside from the Bartz and Boko minions are the Exdeath, Guido, Gilgamesh, Enkidu, Omega, and Shinryu. Guido can be found at the last chest of the Siren Song Sea. Exdeath can be found after defeating Deltascape 4.0. When these two minions meet, they have an interaction where they fight each other. This is a reference to when Exdeath shows himself to Guido, and the two have a conflict with each other. Gilgamesh can be obtained from the achievement shop in Old Gridania. Enkidu can be found at the end of the Battle of the Big Keep trial. Omega can be found after defeating Alphascape 4.0. And Shinryu can be found within a Zadnor lockbox and crafted by weavers. The animation for Shinryu also references the fact that Shinryu in Final Fantasy V is found by opening a chest in the interdimensional rift. 3 jobs introduced in Final Fantasy V that appear in Final Fantasy XIV are the Samurai, Dancer, and Blue Mage. Blue Mage specifically has a lot of aspects that got their start in Final Fantasy V. The idea of having the enemy cast the ability to learn it, and specifically abilities like White Wind, Aqua Breath, and Flamethrower are among many that got their start in Final Fantasy V. The casting animation also comes from Final Fantasy V, and the Blue Mage artifact armor is heavily inspired by the Blue Mage outfits. And while Red Mage wasn't introduced in Final Fantasy V, the concept of dual cast originated with this game, in which you are able to cast another spell immediately after the initial spell. A prevalent character who was mentioned throughout A Realm Reborn and was finally properly introduced to the Warrior of Light in Heavensward is Krile Mare Baldesion. She is based off the character Krile in Final Fantasy V. Her outfit is also a nod to Krile's White Mage outfit. Krile mentions that she is the granddaughter of Galuf Mare Baldesion. Galuf is also a main character in Final Fantasy V. In the Eureka storyline, we see more into the history of Krile, specifically on the island that Krile grew up on, the Isle of Val. Val is the name of the castle that Galuf and Krile live in the original translation of Final Fantasy V. In the storyline, we see Galuf and the other Warriors of Dawn in an Echo flashback. This scene includes Dorgan, Kelger, and Zezat, the other Warriors of Dawn. While we're talking about Eureka, let's talk about a few places in Eureka. As stated before, Val was the name of the original castle that Galuf and Krile live in. There are also many references that make a reference to various figures and places in Final Fantasy V. These places include Klauser's How and Klauser's Peace, both of which are references to Bart's and Dorgan's last name, Klauser. Port Surgate and Surgate Town, references to Castle Surgate. And Val River, which we've already gone through. And one last thing before we move on, the Baldessian Annex in Endwalker has music that features a different version of the Final Fantasy V song, The Day Will Come. The dungeon Sastasha can be seen as a possible nod to the pirate hideout in Final Fantasy V, as both are the first dungeons encountered in both games. The Guardian Tree in Central Shroud can also be seen as a possible nod to the Guardian Tree that was first seen in Final Fantasy V. You first find this tree in Final Fantasy V when you're in Galuf's world, and later it appears in the Merged World. In Eastern Lenosha, there is a magic pot. This magic pot asks for an elixir or a high elixir for a wind-up sun or a wind-up moon. The magic pot first appeared in Final Fantasy V in the Phoenix Tower, where it requests an elixir for massive amounts of XP. In the locks, there is a Moai face underwater. This is possibly a cool subtle nod to the Moai statue found underwater in Final Fantasy V. In Shadowbringers, there is an area known as the Ronkin Ruins. This name is a reference to the Ronka Ruins in Final Fantasy V, in which it was home to an ancient civilization. Near these ruins is Fort Gon, which is a reference to the town of Gon in Final Fantasy V, which was also near their Ronkin Ruins. While Final Fantasy V was not the first time we've seen a Cid in the franchise, it is the first time we've seen a relative to Cid, Mid. We see these two work and research technology of the world of Final Fantasy V together. In Final Fantasy XIV, in a role reversal, Cid's father is known as Midas, which can be seen as a variation of Mid. Midas and Cid were Garlands who worked on the technology of this world together. There is a side quest in the Dravanian Forelands called Let Bygones Be Bygones. In this quest, you aid in healing a dragon's brother using a plant called Wyvern Tails. Using this herb, you tend to the dragon's injuries and heal him using this remedy. This is very similar to when the party goes to the North Mountain to obtain a similar plant with healing properties for dragons called Dragon Grass. Lenna goes to the trouble to find Dragon Grass in order to heal Hiryu's injuries. Later on in the story, the party goes to Drakenvale to find more dragon grass in Galuf's world in order to save Kryle's Windrake. Both the ship graveyard found in Lenosha and the Siren Song Sea are references to the ship graveyard in Final Fantasy V. There is a quest in the ship graveyard that even has you fight against the Siren. The Siren also reappears as the final boss in Faro Sirius. This is also a great time to say that Final Fantasy XIV contains many enemies that originally appeared in Final Fantasy V. I will try to get as many of these as possible for this video, but if I did miss some, let me know in the comments. Several enemies such as the Gaily Cat, the Bandersnatches, Level Checker, and the Enchanted Fan are found in Final Fantasy XIV. The Gaily Cat also has a minion named the Gaily Kitten, which can be obtained from some all. And the Level Checker has a mount that can be obtained by defeating Chi. The Great Google Library is an allusion to the Library of the Ancients in Final Fantasy V. There are many enemies that are references to enemies found in the library, such as page 64, Biblios, and a panda. The Living Flame, which can also be found in the Masked Carnivale, and a liquid variation found in the Alexander Raid, is a reference to the Living Flame boss found in the fire-powered ship. The boss Atomos is found a few times in the Crystal Tower Raid, such as the Labyrinth of the Ancients and the World of Darkness. Carlobos is a boss found in Satstasha Hard Mode that fights very similarly to the fight in Final Fantasy V. Carlobos will get someone to critical health using Tail Screw. Ketoblis is a boss in Halatali Hard Mode that is a reference to the summon Ketoblis. He will use his signature move, Demon Eye. And finally, the Tycoon, the final boss found at the end of the Twinning. This could be a possible reference to the Area Tycoon in Final Fantasy V. Since this is also a castle-like structure, this could also be a reference to the Castle Tycoon in Final Fantasy V. In the Masked Carnivale, there are two specific fights that are references to Final Fantasy V. The first is against Azumalgia. This is a blue mage that appeared in Final Fantasy V. Azumalgia was one of the demons from the Rift that tried to stop Bartz and his team from progressing any further in the interdimensional rift. In both fights, he will use various blue mage spells against you. The second fight is against Gogo. While Gogo's look is based off of Final Fantasy VI's Gogo, Gogo originally appeared in Final Fantasy V as the famed Mimic. In this fight, you must mimic him in order to defeat him. In Final Fantasy XIV, there are certain times where you must do nothing to get past the mechanic, much like the fight in Final Fantasy V. Now, let's talk about our resident dimension traveler, Gilgamesh. We first meet Gilgamesh in the Hildebrand storyline in A Realm Reborn. When we are introduced to him, we also meet a chicken he named Enkidu. Both Gilgamesh and Enkidu comes from Final Fantasy V, although we don't meet the real Enkidu until the second encounter with Gilgamesh. In the first fight against Gilgamesh in Final Fantasy XIV, it is on top of Griffin's Crossing, a big bridge. This alone is already a callback to the first encounter with Gilgamesh in Final Fantasy V, when we first fight him across the big bridge. The music is even an updated version of the Battle on the Big Bridge music. The second time we fight Gilgamesh in both Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy V, he is finally joined with Enkidu. Now, let's talk about the demons from the Rift. These demons were summoned by Exdeath in order to stop Bartz and his party from continuing on. The first one you meet is Melusine. Melusine first appears when she takes over Lenna and attacks the party shortly after. In Final Fantasy XIV, Melusine is a boss in Turn 2 of the second coil of Bahamut. Next is Caliphistery. This boss in Final Fantasy XIV is found in the Weeping City of Mach. The next is a Panda. This boss can be found in the Great Google Library hard mode. Next is Twintanio, which can be found in Turn 5 of the Binding Coils of Bahamut. And finally, Azulmagia, one we've already covered before. These next three demons are found in the Deltascape raids. When we first enter the interdimensional rift in Final Fantasy XIV, we are challenged by Omega in order to prove our strength. The music in the interdimensional rift is the Final Fantasy XIV version of the original interdimensional rift music in Final Fantasy V. The bosses of the first 3 floors uses a new version of the Battle 2 theme from Final Fantasy V. In Deltascape 1.0, Alt-Roy appears. Although not quite, as Alt-Roy in Final Fantasy V appears as an old man before turning into Jura Avis. In Final Fantasy XIV, however, the lizard form takes on the Alt-Roy name. In this fight, you see him do one of his signature moves, Breathwing. Alt-Roy is also a mount found after defeating Deltascape 4.0 Savage. The area in this boss also takes place right outside the castle that appears in the interdimensional rift. Next, in Deltascape 2.0, you face off against Catastrophe. You have an ability that enables you to float to avoid Earthquake from Catastrophe. The boss will then use 100 Gs to disable your float status. In Final Fantasy V, the boss acts the same way, as he will use 100G whenever a party member has float. In Deltascape 3.0, we face off against Halicarnassus. During the fight, there is a section where you must navigate a sand maze. This part is a callback to the shifting sands when we go through the Desert of Mor, and also the first section of the interdimensional rift. Halicarnassus can also be found in Hawk Manor, although that one is only a reference in name. And finally, the final fight of Deltascape, Exdeath. The music used in this fight is the decisive battle from Final Fantasy V. When we first fight Exdeath, he is in his humanoid form. However, his tree form does appear later on. In the Savage version of this fight, his transformation starts off word for word the same way it does in Final Fantasy V, where he is sucked into the void. It is there we meet the final boss of Final Fantasy V. In the coolest boss transition in the game, we meet Neo Exdeath. In this fight, we see a lot of his signature moves from the original game, such as Almagest, and Grand Cross. Now, before we end, we need to talk about two more bosses. In fact, these two bosses were the first true super bosses in the Final Fantasy series, Shinryu and Omega. In the lore of Final Fantasy V, these two were at odds with each other. They were so powerful that they were locked into the interdimensional rift. And for the first time in Final Fantasy history, we see these two fight each other in Final Fantasy XIV. Omega and Shinryu also appear as their own bosses. Shinryu is fought at the end of the original Stormblood storyline, and Omega is fought at the third floor of the Alphascape raids. Omega can also be obtained as a mount after the final fight of the Alphascape raids. And there we have it. Clearly, Final Fantasy XIV takes a lot of inspiration from various ideas from Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V brought about so many new changes and ideas to the Final Fantasy series, and I don't think we'll be seeing the end of these influences anytime soon. As always, if you enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like and subscribe. It will always be appreciated. A shout out to my free company and Static again for helping me find and record some of this footage. And in the next video, we'll be looking at the world of Final Fantasy VI.